Hello everyone, it's Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. I hope everyone is doing all right this morning. Yes, morning back home. If you guys enjoy the content, I'll start off with this one saying if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon, or for that matter, Streamlabs. And by the way, just so I make sure I get what everyone has to say through Streamlabs. Mad Cow, next on Richard Maddow in Italia, how the Italian change in parliament could be linked to the Kremlin. That was from Mad Cow. That's Baltazar giving a comment. So what I want to talk about, still across the pond, I haven't done any issues affecting us here locally, but across the pond, another issue that's turning into this kind of flare-up. Russia has seized multiple ships for the Ukrainian military. I think it's 3 warships. This amounts to a fourth of the Ukrainian military. They don't necessarily have a huge navy. But nevertheless, Russia has seized them off the coast of the Kremlin, of Crimea, which has been annexed by Russia. Now, calling it annexed sounds more ominous than what it is. I mean, ultimately, the Crimea, they voted to go with the Russian side. So from the standpoint of people choosing and having self-determination, they chose. Now, the Western media doesn't necessarily like to bring up this point. They like to act or just use the term annexed to make it look like Russia took it, without any context as to why. Now, the pro-Russian government that was part of the Ukraine was toppled, supported by Western forces, meaning the United States, Western media, rah-rah this. Forget the illegalities of this. They rah-rah this. Right here. This is The Guardian talking about it. Let's flip over. It's not Russia that pushed Ukraine to the brink of war. This is before, this is a little earlier, but this gives this kind of context of what's taking place, or what took place. That might be more explicable if what was going on in East Ukraine now were not the mirror image of what took place in Kiev a couple of months ago. Then it was armed protesters in Maidan Square seizing government buildings and demanding change of government in the Constitution. The United States and European leaders championed the mass militants and denounced the elected government for its crackdown, just as now an unelected government use of force against rebels occupying police stations in towns, halls, and cities such as Slavansk and Donetsk. He's making the point that Western media and Western governments were perfectly okay with this rank coup that took place, while at the same token denouncing, you could say, a secondary push by Russian by people who are supportive of Russia's side in this. When the Ukrainian president was replaced by a U.S. elected administration and an entirely unconstitutional takeover, politicians such as William Hague brazenly misled Parliament about the legality of what had taken place, the imposition of pro-Western government on Russia's most neuralgic and politically divided neighbor. And look at what they mean here. This is the Ukraine. And this is Russia. I know Russia is massive, but you're talking about a coup supported by the West on the border of the Ukraine, on the border of Russia. And not just the coup supported by the West. There were talks about Ukraine joining NATO and whatnot. This is amazing. I mean, this is a brazen shot across the bow for Russia. Now, we were told, or Russia was told, that NATO would not expand at the point where the Soviet Union fell, because what would be the point of NATO in a world where the Soviet Union doesn't exist? NATO limped along, not necessarily having a mission, but expanding nonetheless, and expanding to the border of Russia. Now we, the United States, was willing to go to a nuclear war with with Russian missiles being on Cuba, on our doorstep. Why isn't the same leeway given to Russia? Isn't that odd? I mean, from the standpoint of the United States, we're willing to destroy the entire world if missiles were put on our border. Fair enough. it could provide a security risk. But you're talking about, these are the bases that are near Russia. Look at all this. Who's provoking who? They're surrounding China and they're surrounding Russia, and they've gotten closer and closer. And now Ukraine was one of the other targets that pro-Western forces were trying to take down, giving them an amazing stepping point on the border of Russia. Russia responded. Their response was to support pro-Russian militants and to sever off as part of Ukraine. Now, I give that, and I say that because I want to give context to what's taking place and not just the Western media's narrative of this stuff. The West also has been supporting Nazis because Nazis have been making up this right-wing, militant wing of forces that's been pushing back against Russians. And the West have been pretending as if it's been Russian propaganda that Nazis were a part of this movement, or you could say a part of this organization. But right here, as of neo-Nazis, by the way, John McCain was side by side with a Nazi as it denounced Russia for supporting anti-Western forces as it tries to sever off part of the Ukraine. Azov's neo-Nazi's character has been covered by the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, The Telegraph, Reuters, among others. On-the-ground journalists from established Western media outlets have written of witnessing SS-ruined swastikas, torchlight marches, and Nazi salutes. They interviewed Azov soldiers who radically acknowledge being neo-Nazis. And by the way, we have been giving resources and support to those Nazis, knowing that those weapons and those munitions and that training was going to be used to kill Russians. This pro-Putin puppet president that is Donald Trump giving weapons that's going to go to killing Nazis or killing Russians. But he's Putin's puppet. This stuff is nonsense. This Russiagate stuff is nonsense. But let's go with what took place today. 3 ships were sailing off the coast of the Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. Russia opened fire before its special forces stormed the vessels. Between 3 and 6 Ukrainians were injured. Ukraine said it was Russia's act of aggression. Moscow said the ships had illegally entered their waters. Let's go to another place that's covering it. The Independent. Russia disputes Ukraine's version of events. 3 of its boats were attacked, fired on. Russia disputes Ukraine's version of events. But there's been recordings of the exchange between Russians and Ukrainian servicemen that kind of gives this point across that Russia probably did board the ships and did take those ships over. Not saying they're right, just saying what happened. They're in a war at this point, and they're acting as countries act in war. Let's keep going. Russia disputes Ukraine's version of events that 3 of its boats were attacked, fired on, and seized without reason as they attempted to access the Ukrainian-controlled port of the Azov Sea. Russia insists that the route of the 3 Ukrainian boats was a provocation and that they were encroached on its maritime territory. Now, there were obvious issues with Russia's account. First, the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait are, according to a 2003 treaty, shared waters. Well, these countries are at war now, so this idea of a shared waters in a treaty becomes somewhat nonsense. Countries at war act as if they're at war. Second, the distress signal received from the Ukrainian boat was approximately 1 kilometer outside of the Russian waters. And third, a similar group of Ukrainian vessels completed the same trip just a few months ago. Let's see. Tensions have been building for several months, with Ukraine complaining that Russian border guards have been harassing commercial boats in an attempt to impose a de facto economic blockade. As of today, the blockade is fully declared one, with Russia having parked a tanker across one of the Kerch Bridge for quote-unquote security reasons. It's unclear when, if ever, the shipping lanes will be reopened. The Russian seizure of 3 ships is a severe blow to the Ukrainian Navy and represents a quarter of its fleet. Little is known of the fate of the 23 servicemen involved, or the 6 men reported injured. 3, according to Russia. But the circumstances, in some sense, are a replay of the events in Crimea in 2014 in which Russia took over several vessels. Look, Ukraine should have a certain degree of self-determination. The catch being, if that self-determination was that they wanted to be more pro-Russian, then they wanted to be more pro-Russian. The problem is that the West instigated itself into the affairs of this nation, in which case Russia instigated itself for reasons dealing with its border or protecting and securing its border. Again, I make the point, this is not about right or wrong. This is about what countries do when they feel that their interests are being challenged or their interests are being impinged upon. And it is absolutely against Russian interests to have a Western force on the Ukrainian border or have Ukraine taken over by the West. Also, again, we were willing to end the world when Russian missiles were being put into Cuba. And I don't quite get why the same leeway isn't given for Russia to have control of its own border regions. I don't know what the United States has to do with the Ukraine at all, for that matter, or how the $700 billion that we're spending on our military, should that be used in areas that we have no involvement in. I guess I'm saying we've taken a posture that the world is our playground and that we don't want to have any other force to challenge us, be it China or be it another Soviet Union. But that position pivots you into a military provocation across the globe, seeing as countries are going to want to have sovereignty across their own borders, especially a country that has been invaded multiple times, where they've had millions of people killed during those invasions by Western forces. So I'm going to end this here. This is not necessarily a right or wrong. This is something of the just is. And in securing its borders or securing its regions, Russia has deemed it necessary in order to take several ships from the Ukraine and to create a military blockade in that area of the globe. Let me see, do I have a picture of that? I think I used that picture before. Also, this is the first time that these guys have clashed, not necessarily as a proxy, but as a direct involvement where Russia itself fired on Ukrainian vessels. But let's not pretend that there weren't hostilities between these two and that the de facto little green men thing. I understand. It's kind of like if my wife fixes me something and I make the comment to her, ugh, this isn't bad. She knows I probably don't like it. But that's different than me saying, oh my God, this is horrible. Both are getting across displeasure, but one is brazen and open. It's similar in this case of a proxy war versus direct action by a military on another military. So that's the story. That's the report. I don't know if anybody is here or even care about this particular story. Let's see. Ukraine press is very low approval rating. Yes. So the president in Ukraine has imposed a what do they call it? Martial law. Now, in imposing martial law, part of the reason that they're doing this is because of the Russia thing. But the imposition of martial law doesn't fully make sense here. When things were worse off, there wasn't an imposition of martial law. And the thought is that this may be political. That part of this, he has a presidential election coming up in March. And that Russia doing this, it doesn't necessarily make sense that Russia is doing this to impose any kind of imposition into the politics of the Ukraine, meaning the election that's coming up. But it does make sense that the president of the Ukraine may use this for his political ends to push against the Russia, quote-unquote, Russian threat. Russian martial law would allow a delay in elections. Yes, but the elections aren't until March. And the martial law that the person imposes goes for 30 days. Doesn't necessarily mean that he couldn't extend it further, but just saying. All we know at this moment is that Russia took several ships and is imposing a kind of blockade. And understand the context of this. We've been supporting Nazis. We've been given weapons and training, that weapons and training being used to kill Russians. And openly knowing that these are Nazis, reported by multiple press that have been propping up the Ukrainian government, that hasn't bothered the Western journalists at all. There was a revolution against the president of the Ukraine that was pro-Moscow. There was a counter-revolution that carved up Ukraine, and you could say the Russian part and the non-Russian part. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else associated with this? And of course, the West freaks out over this. Germany has put out this feelers trying to say that, you know, let's be calm about this. Let's not allow hostilities to flare up. But this is still a powder keg. And we have a president that may, God forbid, he institutes any kind of policy where he's dumping in even more weapons into this country. This is none of our business, full stop. It's not that I don't care about this idea of Ukrainian independence, but I've met people from the Ukraine who were pro-Russian and said they just wanted this conflict to stop, and they had family members that were in some of these bombardments and that they spoke Russian. Now, this was before I was able to really hear the story coming out, and this was my first time hearing somebody who was from that particular part of the world and that was in the Russian area of that world, giving me that perspective saying, look, I am okay with being in this Russian-speaking part, and I don't like the conflict that has been taking place. So I'll leave this here. This has gone on too long. All right, guys, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.